Hello and welcome. I'm Rebecca Vincent, Director of International Campaigns at Reporters Without Borders. We're known internationally as Reporters Sans Frontières. So if I say RSF, that's why. I'm joined here by four brilliant panelists to discuss violence and other threats against freelance journalists around the world. So we're joined by Banjo Damilola, who is an investigative journalist from Nigeria. She reports on education, health, and social justice, and she's one of Transparency International's young journalists from 2018. Eloïse Bajou is a French journalist and photographer, as well as a member of Reporter en Colère, a journalist collective created in 2019 that aims to give tools to field reporters when they experience press freedom restrictions. Jiayang Fan became a staff writer at The New Yorker in 2016. Her reporting on China, American politics, and culture has appeared in the magazine since 2010. And Trevor Timm is a co-founder and the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. He is a journalist, activist, and legal analyst whose writing has appeared in a number of publications. So thank you for joining us for this panel. So we're talking today about threats specifically against freelance journalists. And just to note, kind of a global overview, RSF has tracked so many cases of violence against journalists over the past decade. Nearly 1,000 journalists have been killed around the world. Just over 400 of those were freelancers, and that really underscores the specific threats faced by freelancers. But of course, the range of threats can take many forms. And so we'll be talking about country contexts from France to the United States, from Hong Kong to Nigeria, and bringing the conversation more globally as well. Perhaps if I could start with Trevor, since the US is so in the focus at the moment in the international news. Many of us have been glued to US elections coverage in the past week, but in addition to many other political issues, press freedom really has been at the forefront of concern in the US this year. The Press Freedom Tracker has reported more than 880 aggressions against the press this year alone. Could you talk to us a bit about the climate in the United States for press freedom, and particularly how that's affecting freelance journalists there?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thank you for having me. This is a wonderful event with incredible panelists, and I'm excited to learn from everybody here. But Freedom of the Press Foundation runs the US Press Freedom Tracker, which actually RSF is a partner and many other press freedom organizations in the United States. And basically the idea behind it is to comprehensively track the number of press freedom violations in the US. And so, that can mean anything from a journalist arrested, a journalist physically attacked, a journalist shot with projectiles like rubber bullets, a journalist subpoenaed, denied access to public events, censored via a legal process. There's about a dozen categories which we try to not only count in a meticulous manner, but actually write an individual story for each incident that happens. So for the public record, essentially, so that journalists can have it, that advocacy organizations can use it, and the public can know what is going on. And so, as you mentioned, in 2020, press freedom has hit basically an unprecedented crisis level in the United States. So for example, we've been tracking these types of numbers on the Press Freedom Tracker since 2017. So from each year, from 2017, 2018, and then 2019, there was about 100 to 150 press freedom violations each year. And now we thought that was a rather large number. Donald Trump had entered office by then, was constantly talking about journalists as the enemies of the people. The number of journalists arrested and physically attacked seemed to tick up. But since the protests started around George Floyd in late May, there have been 900 press freedom attacks in the United States. So that's a 600% increase over last year. And so that includes over 120 journalists arrested, over 200 of them physically assaulted, over 200 shot with rubber projectiles like rubber bullets, and dozens more tear gassed and pepper sprayed. And so it has been a situation where there are scores and scores of journalists trying to cover these historic protests, which we haven't seen in a generation, where they are either being kind of attacked along with the protesters by the police, or in many cases singled out because they are journalists. There's many live videos of police seeing a camera crew clearly with press credentials on, holding a camera and microphones calmly away from the scene, turning and either firing their weapons on them when they know that they're press, or going up and arresting them because of it. And this has happened now in city after city after city. There's some 60 odd cities where at least one press freedom incident has occurred. And there's been at least 2 cities that have had 100 or more of these incidents occurred. So like I said, this is really an unprecedented situation that we have never seen before in modern history. And you know, every press freedom organization, I think, in the United States and around the world is trying to grapple with it.
As we often say at Reporters Without Borders, it's simply not good enough for the country of the First Amendment, because in many ways the US is still seen as a leader when it comes to free speech issues. On our World Press Freedom Index, the US has now slipped to 45th out of 180 countries, one of many democracies that we've referred to as deteriorating in recent years. If we go down further in our World Press Freedom Index, if we think of countries that are at, not at the top, but much further up like the US, and the example that sets for other parts of the world. Banjo, maybe I could take it to you. We're looking at Nigeria. Nigeria is 115th on our index out of 180 countries. And you've personally experienced intimidation, censorship, surveillance, and other forms of pressure. Could you talk to us about the situation for journalists on the ground there?
I mean, journalism in Nigeria, like every part of the world, because like you said, even the US, that most countries around the world look up to, I mean, freedom of speech there is deteriorating with recent events there, but particularly in Nigeria, it's been difficult. It's been tough. You hardly can get anything done as a journalist. It's difficult to get access to information. And even when you're on the field, you are easily singled out. Recently, a 20-year-old young journalist was arrested and he was taken into custody by some of the state security, and then he was killed. 2 days later, we just got the news that he's dead. And that's the kind of situation that journalists in Nigeria actually face every time on their job. It's not safe to simply want to pass information across, to simply want to educate people, to simply want to throw more light on issues. It's not safe to do that in Nigeria. And it's particularly dangerous for freelance journalists. Freelance journalists, there's no structure, so to say, for freelance journalists. And except you're working, you're freelancing for international media, and who can, sometimes look after you. Well, maybe, but most Nigerians freelance journalists, they freelance for local papers, and local papers cannot even adequately take care of their staff. And it's difficult to then give attention to the freelance journalists. So if you're freelance, you're totally on your own. So you have to create a mechanism around yourself to provide safety. So when you're going out for a story, you tell somebody in your family, your friend, just check on me if you've not heard from me in 2-3 hours. And that's how you really have to work as a freelance journalist in Nigeria. The government is not receptive of the work that we do as journalists. And at every point, the government really think that you're out against them. And so they want to shut you down, even on the littlest of things. They just want to shut you down.
So far, 2 examples in very different country contexts of violence by police against journalists covering demonstrations, just doing their jobs. And of course, that's been the case in Hong Kong as well. The world has watched, coverage, including many acts of aggression, tear gassing, and other things against journalists in Hong Kong. Jiayang, could you talk to us more about what that was like covering on the ground, and what the situation as it continues now, as the world has sort of is not scrutinizing it maybe as closely as some weeks and months ago?
Right. Right. So I was in Hong Kong a year ago, more than a year ago, covering the pro-democracy protests on the ground. And I have to clarify that I am not a freelance journalist. I'm a staff writer for the New Yorker. But I think the risks and the kind of the proximity to violence in Hong Kong is such that for freelancers and non-freelancers, I think we face some of the same problems. And I think part of the challenge of reporting on Hong Kong is you are, for me, I was coming from New York, bringing all this, gear with me, whether it's, tear gas, masks, or helmets, and you go in there with such a sense of, trying to, armor yourself against possible danger. And sometimes, and as, and of course that is, the most prudent thing to do. But then as a reporter, you're also, there's an impulse to go into situations where there's oftentimes, the most fire and the most violence, because you want to make sure that the voices behind those who are feeling, the most aggrieved are being heard. So there is so there is a paradox there in terms of looking out for your own safety. And in terms of press freedom, I think in Hong Kong you see, at least for me, it was very evident that that one wants to hear the voices of the protesters. And before I even landed in Hong Kong, most of the stories that I was hearing from the West were, they all kind of cohered around a narrative based on, from the viewpoint of the protesters. And I felt that as someone who was already so sympathetic and who is, who is very much for the value, the liberal values of democracy and freedom of speech, the journalist in me wanted to make sure that I could, at least in my articles, represent the viewpoints of everyone kind of in the city, and even ones that I might not personally agree with. So I think that, and hearing also about how people felt toward violence from every single kind of perspective. I mean, there were the protesters who were there kind of risking, their safety to, to be making their voices heard. And then there were those, who were very, and then there were those, very much against the protesters who were saying, we want to put, we want to put a stop to the violence. And and I'm not sure if these protesters realize how much they are tearing the city apart by continuing with the violence. So so I think there's just, there is so much going on in those situations, and I think you want to be aware that the violence is essentially what's attracting the world's attention to what is to that particular region. But there is so much complexity to be uncovered and so many points of view to be represented beyond kind of what is the most sensational, or what is the most kind of what the behind the photos that you often see of of literally just fire and fireworks, that you really want to get to the bottom of what's causing that.
So we've heard examples in two other country contexts of authorities really not understanding or respecting the role of journalists in covering demonstrations. Did you feel in Hong Kong that at least that your role was understood? Did the authorities treat you with at least a bit of respect and allow you to do your job?
Right. Yeah, I think that, I mean, in Hong Kong, I was actually, I was actually quite, compared to my experience in mainland China, I felt like, relatively speaking, I had a lot of press freedom, just in even being able to take photos of these police brigades, and being able to stand very close to the scene. I think yeah, so that was, of course I did hear when I was there of reporters being hurt, some losing an eye and some others being bodily injured and being not, if not exactly roughed up, but of being, treated not terribly well by the police officers. So I do think there was very, there is always that tension, between the authority and the threat of what, what journalists are sent there to do. But for me personally, I did feel, maybe just because I'm so accustomed to reporting in China, where press freedom is almost non-existent, Hong Kong felt, like I at least had a little bit of room to maneuver in, which which I guess it's all relative. But perhaps I needed greater expectations. But given the circumstances, I was I was grateful to be able to capture kind of whatever footage I did.
And indeed, it is relative. I don't think I mentioned Hong Kong on our World Press Freedom Index comes in at 80th out of 180 countries, which compared to others in the region is not as poor as it could be. So indeed, I could imagine coming from China how it could feel just that bit freer in actually doing your job.
Right.
Coming back up the index, so France is ranked 34th out of 180 countries. It's right above the UK, which often gets mentioned to me here. But we've also seen really worrying behavior by police in particular towards journalists covering protests. I think the world did notice a bit the rise of the Gilets Jaunes. And you formed, Eloïse, a new organization called Reporter en Colère. Could you talk to us a bit about that? And I think for non-French speakers as well, explain that en colère.
En colère means a bit angry, because on the field we encountered a lot of problems during the last years, especially during the Gilets Jaunes protest, which took place in 2019, but also before. Actually, some of us had already witnessed intolerable drifts on the zone à défendre, zone to defend of Notre-Dame-des-Landes, for example, with a serious increase of police custody and injured journalists. And we could no longer just sign press releases and opinions, so we decided to create Reporter en Colère, a collective of freelance journalists, but not only students also, and staff journalists too, in order to organize ourselves, to find tools, to create tools, to manage to work in those conditions we saw getting worse and worse, and also to sensitize the population and to find a way to deal with the situation and to make it a little bit better. So it's a story of friends, actually. At the beginning, a group of half a dozen of freelancers. We used to know each other, see each other on the field. And at the beginning, one of us was put in custody during a protest. He was walking in the street and just going to the zone of the protest, and during a bag and body search, his personal protective equipment were confiscated, and as he was protesting against this, he was put in custody. So that, I think, that was the awakening for us, and so we decided after that to organize ourselves. And it must be borne in mind that majority of freelancers in France are often precarious journalists, and it's maybe that the thing that links us in Reporters en Colère, that's why maybe we're en colère too. Freelance journalists and new in profession journalists and photojournalists are are the most economically precarious journalists in France, clearly. Sometimes some are under the status of self-employed person, which is completely illegal in France, although they provide footage for most of 24/7 news channel. And we assist to a very important change in legislative framework in France. We no longer than this morning, we saw from the employment office in France a new line in the text which make the card press needed to just ask for an help from some I don't know how to say economical help. And if you don't have the press card, which is not compulsory in French text, you cannot just have your money at the end of the month, which make the situation very, very extremely worrying in France, actually.
Does that make a practical difference when you're out in the field covering something like a protest? How, are there situations where authorities might be demanding accreditation that you don't have as a freelancer? Yeah.
And that's when I talked about the legislative framework, that's the main point in France, actually. Emergency acts, state of emergency laws became included during the last four or 5 years in the ordinary laws. And it's a progressive slide in the practice of police officers, which are problematic. In case it's always in the small failures of the law, and it's the problem, essentially a problem of how to say that? It's like a gray zone. It's always in the discretionary power of police that it takes place. For example, the press card to get into a zone of protest is not necessary, but they always ask it, and they ask it not only to know who is on the field, but to make the tense get upper and upper and upper and get the situation to degrade and have a reason to put all these freelancers in custody, actually. And it's always a scale of tensions that takes place during the protests. During the last 2 years, it's very, very, you can see it, you can feel it everywhere.
So something that seems administrative on paper actually can have quite a practical difference in terms of safety and security of journalists in practice. I believe it was the Frontline Freelance Register that did a survey, I want to say last year in 2019, although time is no longer passing in a normal state. And the single biggest issue identified by freelancers that they surveyed internationally was this difficulty in getting accreditation and getting press cards. So they launched a freelance press card scheme, which Reporters Without Borders has endorsed, and I think around a dozen other press freedom and free expression organizations. But it's interesting that in so many country contexts that actually, again, something that might just seem administrative can really make a difference. Banjo, I want to bring you back in because we lost you in the middle of your brilliant comments. Could I take that question to you actually about practical issues with freelancers? Are administratively, are freelancers able to work, and are there things like this that actually create more physical risks for journalists that could be resolved with maybe some pressure on the authorities to accommodate and recognize freelance journalists properly?
Well, again, it really depends on the media house that the freelance journalist is working for, but largely is that most times freelance journalists would have to find a means to get an ID card, for example, so that you can identify yourself as a journalist, and you have to So if you're freelancing for, say, a media house that is not quite popular, that might be a very big problem for you when you're out on the field. If you're freelancing with a relatively known media house and they have provided you with ID card and tags and things to identify yourself when you're out there, it does not necessarily protect you from harassment, but at least you have something to show to say that, oh, I'm a journalist, and there's a record for you to say that this journalist from this media organization was taken in, and that it's a little bit easier to find you. But if you're with a less popular, less known media house, it's really difficult because you can just disappear and nobody knows where you've gone into. Nobody can trace you because in the first place, the media house that you work with is not known, and the government are not even receptive of journalists who are from very known and popular media houses. So it's really complicated. Apart from cases of identification, it's really difficult for you to go out in Nigeria and say, oh, I'm freelance journalist and I think I can cover it. It's totally, you'll be risking your life to do that. You go into protests and say, oh, I'm freelance journalist and I'm just here to cover it with my camera. And you can't do that. You really cannot do that. It's dangerous. They can pick you up, and by day I mean the police can pick you up and say you're recording without permits, or you don't have authorization to do the work that you do. Of course, these are things that they would also tell to a journalist who can properly identify his or herself. But for a freelance journalist who do not have this identification, it's even a lot more difficult.
Sure. Well, one question I have, because in our advocacy work, we're often trying to get at accountability. When any of you attempt to hold authorities to account for these sorts of violations, what happens? I'll take this to Trevor first, because I know you guys do try to see these cases through, right? What happens if you take complaints to authorities? Do you see, for example, police being individually held to account for specific aggressions against journalists? How are things going in the US?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there's two aspects to this. One, it's after an initial act happens. So for example, an arrest. A journalist is arrested while covering a protest or some other public event. In the past, when there wasn't video of an arrest, for example, or people taking photographs or a lot of witnesses, or something like the US Press Freedom Tracker writing a story about it immediately and tweeting to all of its followers. That journalist may have been held in jail overnight or over the weekend. They may have charges brought against them, and they may actually have to defend them in court. Thankfully, because all of those things that I just mentioned are much more prevalent now, what ends up happening is journalists are released from custody a lot quicker. Police and prosecutors are much more reluctant to press charges. And there is generally the ability of journalists to essentially get out of trouble a bit quicker because of all of this new technology and new infrastructure, which is a positive development. But as far as accountability for the people who have undertaken these actions, primarily the police officers involved or their superiors, if they were given orders of any kind, that accountability is still few and far between. You know, we've seen, even though there are often videos of these incidents, we will still see police blatantly lying about what happened just after the event. I mean, actually, this just happened yet again in New York City. Just a week or two ago, where there was a journalist who was arrested by the New York Police Department. It was actually quite a violent arrest. And she was on video clearly explaining that she was a journalist the entire time. Now, speaking of press passes, the New York Police Department actually controls the press pass credentialing policy in New York City. So that the NYPD essentially does not consider anybody a journalist who it didn't personally give a press pass to, which of course is a ludicrous definition. And they've made it very difficult for journalists to get press passes. But because of this very misleading loophole / statement, the NYPD said, no, it's false. We did not arrest a journalist. When it was obvious to the public, anybody who'd watched the video, that they had. And so there is, just when we're talking about, for example, police brutality, or the killing of so many unarmed Black men by police officers in the United States, where there is a failure of accountability when these things happen, even when they're caught on tape. Not to compare the two situations. Obviously, one is still much more serious than the other, but it is similar in one respect. Oftentimes, there is no accountability, and the police, for that reason, are allowed to continue to do it.
Do you think that there's a direct correlation with the rhetoric from the national government, the federal government in this instance, with this sort of hostile rhetoric, enemies of the people language, and clear lies sometimes from the president of the United States, and then how that trickles down into local authorities? Do you see that correlation?
I definitely think that Trump's rhetoric is pouring fuel on the fire, but I think it's a mistake for people to blame this solely or even mainly on Trump. I mean, so we can go back to, for example, the Ferguson protests in 2014 when Barack Obama was president. A protest started in a very similar manner, where a Black man was killed by police. Reporters from all over the country came to the city to cover the protests, and there was 15 or 20 reporters arrested then in 2014. It didn't get the same type of coverage it's getting now, though it was a national issue. But there was not, even though Twitter was around and people were using it, there was no quick way to post a video so that everybody could see it. So there wasn't that visceral reaction that everybody had. I think the problem is much more systematic than Donald Trump. I mean, because if we look at who's in charge of these local authorities, many of them are Democratic administrations too on the city level. That's not to say all of them. A lot of them are Republican as well. But I think there has been some rush in the media to blame Donald Trump for all of this, when it's really a much more systemic problem, where police, whether it's the federal, the state, or the local level, seem to have the green light to use every excuse to arrest or attack journalists. And if you're a journalist or anybody who cares about free speech rights, it's quite disturbing.
Eloïse, if I could come back to you, because I know Reporters en Colère also sometimes does litigate examples of violations towards the media. Where do you get with these cases in France? Is there ever accountability?
Yeah, there's accountability, but it's very, very, very long, and it's very rare. Actually, there was one collective complaint that was set on 2019, which is still open, and nothing happens. Something very specific in France is that we have the Police Nationale, National Police, and the General Inspection Service depends on the same administration as the National Police. So the service which is supposed to investigate about police abuse depend on the same administration, which poses a clear problem of independence. And that's one of our big problem in France, actually. And the second one is that freelancers are often an ideal target for the speech which would aim to point out radical or militant journalists. shown as non-professional, and who often are simply denied the status of journalists, nor even whistleblowers, which is quite clearly defined by French laws and therefore quite restricted in this definition. And we also have a problem with the Federation of Police Officers, which targets journalists on social media a lot, with credible death threats sometimes, on social media services, but also on the field. And for example, Taha Bouafs, which is one quite famous journalist in France, received hundreds of threats each day, mostly from far and alt-right supporters, but also from Police Officers Federation. And it's almost each time just after a press article or a program about him or his work, which is quite worrying, actually.
Well, I'll shift it in a slightly different direction now. We know freelancers are one of the most at-risk categories of journalists, but when we're talking about safety, also, we know that women journalists are often facing an additional layer of threats, sometimes compared to their male counterparts. I wonder if practically in your own work, maybe if I could take this to Jiayang and Banjo as well, have you felt either in covering protests or in other ways that you were more at risk or faced specific safety concerns because of your gender?
I'm lucky enough that I don't usually, I haven't felt too much threat of physical violence as a woman, but I do feel that in predominantly patriarchal societies in China and in most of East Asia, there is this assumption that a woman reporter is perhaps not to be taken as seriously as if I were a man and writing for a Western outlet, a white man. So I think oftentimes I go into reporting interviews where my subject presumes that I'm the assistant and wonders when the reporter will actually show up, which is mostly which is, I mean, I find it quite comical, and it can be condescending, but it's not a situation where I fear for my safety per se, but it does create a curious dynamic where as a reporter, you are very aware of your identity first and foremost as a woman and as a young woman, and you, I think, creatively try to report to have the subject take you seriously and take your question seriously, but also sometimes when when that proves fruitless, you I think ask questions that I think cater to your subject's sense of superiority kind of over your youth and over your gender. So it does pose really interesting questions about how to report in scenarios where you're fundamentally not taken very seriously, and how to go about doing your job when when there's this kind of fundamental asymmetry of power between you, and oftentimes in those situations I try not to let on the fact that I feel condescended. I try to still ask the questions that I need to ask, and I try to when so much of reporting is about communication and about trying to coax a story from someone, I try to use the fact that I'm not taken as seriously and almost dismissed as a way of coaxing out a story casually. Like if they think that I'm not a heavy hitter, I think, is there a way to then at least engage them in what they consider to be, a trivial chat, so that they can, they can, tell me the story as if they were telling the story to their child, or to to a young assistant. So I think there are ways of trying to get around that, but fundamentally, I mean, it does not feel good to be I do worry about the next generation of female reporters, and having to work in this environment, and what it means to be so regularly dismissed and disrespected, and the toll that it takes on those who want to pursue this profession. I mean, whether they feel like it's a challenge that they have to creatively maneuver around, or whether it just is such a such a show of disrespect that that they don't want to pursue the profession at all. So that does worry me as a female reporter.
Banjo, how does that resonate with you, and what's your experience been in Nigeria? Do you feel at times more at risk being a woman journalist there?
Well, I think that Jiayang,
Jiayang, yes.
Yes, kind of captured some of the realities here too in Nigeria. I mean, personally, for me, I've not been, I don't think that being a woman makes my work more difficult, or reduces my access to things. It actually, in some ways, plays to my advantage, because it takes away suspicion from me. And so if I go undercover, I don't attract much attention as a male colleague would, because really Nigerians really don't pay much attention to women. So I can really be underground and just get whatever I want to get, and quickly I'm out of that space before they even notice that a woman was there. And I can do that because I'm woman, and Nigerians really don't pay more attention to women. And so somehow it works in your advantage. But what I would think, what I should highlight here is that, although I've not experienced this, but there are colleagues who have had bad experiences with fellow colleagues, male colleagues, who tend to want to sexually harass colleagues who are female. So you could, for example, at the last at the protest that happened recently, there were incidents of female journalists claiming they were harassed during the protest by protesters, male protesters. And now this is a general issue in Nigeria. Sexual harassment is really big in Nigeria, and so it's only reasonable that if glitters into journalism, and female journalists who are practicing actually suffer this during the course of doing their work. But on a larger scale, I think being a woman, if you would take those disadvantage, the fact that people really don't pay you much attention, you can somehow take that to your advantage. And that's what I do when I go on the field. And I just take the patronizing niceties that might come from male subjects, and I just kind of use it in my advantage and get things done, and I'm out of the space.
made a good point there about the harassment not from police but from others, and that's something that we haven't touched on yet, because that's been the case in many of these other demonstrations that we've discussed as well. What do we do when it's not the police that are the aggressors, but it's protesters? How can we equip journalists to be prepared for those situations and to be able to safely do their job in the face of hostility, sometimes from protesters themselves? We saw that a bit in the UK earlier this year. There were protests here after, following the wave of protests in the United States. We had Black Lives Matter protests here too, and none of the violence that we documented here was from police. It was from protesters shouting things like scum media. These things, we hear public officials sometimes use these terms, but some protesters themselves turned quite volatile on the journalists. Trevor, that has been the case in some of the violence that you've documented in the US, right? And how can we combat that when there are not necessarily officials that are then responsible?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. So when we document, for example, when we document physical attacks on the US Press Freedom Tracker, we're documenting physical attacks by police officers, but also by private citizens. And while the majority of physical attacks, actually the large majority, have come from police officers, that still means that there were dozens that came from private citizens, often very serious. So these not only came from, for example, protests or protesters who were supporting Black Lives Matter. A lot of these actually came from counter protesters who were against Black Lives Matter. Some of them even came from passersby who weren't even protesting anything. It can create a very dangerous environment for journalists where they have to worry about basically a whole gamut of people they are potentially covering. There was actually even one case that we found where somebody was in the morning, basically arrested by the police, was later released, and then came back to cover the protest and was later assaulted by a protester, all in the same day. And so that, I think, with all of the private citizen physical assaults, which we have definitely seen increase in the US in the past few years, not just in the context of the George Floyd protests, but more in general. I think that's where the heated rhetoric really can affect what happens and how people perceive journalists. Where, in a lot of cases, rightly or wrongly, they perceive, whether it's photos of protesters or coverage of individual protesters, they consider this affront to their rights. And it often leads to confrontation. And, I think it's our job as press freedom advocates to really explain to the public that, attacking a journalist, no matter what you think of them or their coverage, affects the rights of everybody. And, should be looked at in a case where if it's the police doing it, it's wrong. And if it's private citizens, it's just as wrong.
Eloïse, how has that played out in France? Have there been instances of Gilets Jaunes, for example, attacking protesters?
The situation
attacking journalists covering the protests, rather.
The situation is quite similar to the one in United States, actually, for some different reasons, but it's quite similar. We also had to face with some violence from the Gilets Jaunes protesters, mostly linked to the concentration of media owners and the importance of 24/7 information in the way people inform themselves in France. And we took a lot of time actually to explain how we work. And I think that's the point that was the most important for us. We spent a lot of time on the field to talk with people and to explain the way we work, the way we exchange with the different media we work with, the way information is built and structured, and what we have to face with when we're journalists and when we need to put the information in form. And we had plenty of very interesting conversation, and and we try to make this work continue in time, and to think about some different form to inform people about the building of information. And I think that the most important lesson we took from this this year almost of protest in France.
We focused a lot on physical violence, but of course, there's also been a proliferation in online violence. And something we point to at RSF is very much that we're seeing increasingly that line being blurred between online violence and offline violence, and that the fact that online threats and harassment and intimidation can now increasingly result in a real life manifestation of that. Actually, Trevor, could I take that back to you? Because we've seen that play out to some extent in the United States. I'm thinking in the most extreme example of the Capitol Gazette newsroom shooting carried out by an individual that had been threatening the newsroom on Twitter. Have you tracked many cases where journalists are reporting this sort of online harassment, abuse, threats, and intimidation?
I mean, definitely from anecdotal evidence, journalists are facing a torrent of abuse, harassment, and even threats, whether it's online or offline threats, say, for example, to a voicemail or even physically. There have been a handful of cases over the past few years where that people were actually arrested for either making bomb threats or death threats to journalists. Unfortunately, threats and harassment that don't reach the level of law enforcement involvement are far too common, and it would almost be impossible to track, given that virtually every journalist is on social media, and there are just thousands and thousands and thousands of comments per day that are lobbed at journalists, and unfortunately, a lot of them are it can end up being disturbing. And journalists have expressed to us at Freedom of the Press Foundation serious concern over this, and for good reason. And so one of the things that we do at Freedom of the Press Foundation, for example, is we have a digital security training team. And part of what we've been talking or doing courses on is the threat of being doxxed, or the threat of being harassed, and the mitigation steps that you can take to potentially prevent at least some of the worst abuses. This is never going to be something that anybody can totally prevent, but there are ways to protect yourself if you are worried about this type of thing.
So, well, I know that Banjo has to go in just a moment, but I'd like to ask her one more question that then I will take to all of the other panelists, if that's okay, because we've talked a lot about the problem, but let's talk about solutions. What can be done both in your country context and globally? What do you see as steps that we can take as press freedom supporters or journalists or others just that are interested to ensure a better climate for safety of journalists? Banjo, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would think that first, the people really need to use their voice and understand that journalists are really working in the advantage of the public interest. And so the people need to always speak up when a journalist is getting harassed. For Nigeria, for example, I think that government sometimes are forced to act accordingly when the pressure from the people is really intense. But what happens most of the time is that when a journalist gets picked up, if the journalist is not popular, if the media house is not popular, people don't really talk about it, and so it just fizzles out and a journalist is locked up somewhere. And so advocacy people generally need to use their voices more, and there needs to be more laws that protect journalists. Globally, journalists there should be some protection for journalists, either you're freelance, either you're a staffer somewhere. There should be some kind of legislation that can really protect journalists, and that can that a journalist can hold on to and say, this is my safety net. So I think that would be 1-2 ways to protect journalists.
Thank you so much. And I know you have to step out to another engagement, so thank you very much for joining the panel tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And Jiayang, I'll take the same question to you, if that's okay. What do you see as the way forward? What are some solutions to these?
Right. Well, I just wanted to pause for a quick minute on your last question, which I thought was a great one about what happens when you are facing violence from the protesters, which was something that did happen to me in Hong Kong. It was not violence per se, but it was harassment, and the dynamics was particularly interesting because I had been called out as a member, I guess, of Western press for favoring the pro-democracy protesters. And the situation in Hong Kong was that the pro-democracy protesters, many of them are native Hong Kongers. They are, some of them looked askance and were, suspicious of mainlanders. And I'm someone, as a Chinese American, who was born on the mainland and moved to the US when I was quite young. So I still speak Mandarin, which is a dialect of the mainland. And I was in this very uncomfortable and awkward situation of writing this piece that was largely sympathetic to the protesters. But then as someone with ethnically Chinese face and who's speaking Mandarin, then being accused of being kind of a mainlander infiltrator in the protests, and perhaps not a member of the Western press, as I said I was. I mean, and this, which goes to show the kind of assumptions and presumptions that can come in certain, regions of the world from just having that isn't as exposed to diversity and multi-ethnic cultures, and that then quickly spread online. I mean, I know, as you said, online trolling and vitriol can be a sort of cyber violence unto itself. So and it left me quite discombobulated for some time, because it felt so intense, and it was also and it also makes you kind of question how how tapped into reality kind of those on every those on every perspective of an issue is. And I would say, I mean, there's no easy solution to disinformation and to kind of the presumptions that we live with and are so kind of deeply, I guess, wedded to. But since so many of us reporters and those and readers are plugged in online, I do think that greater measures to police disinformation online could help. And also reporting, and this, I'm speaking as a reporter myself, so I think I carry some of the responsibility here, that is less kind of geared with an agenda and more in the service of just presenting the readers with the facts and what with a as comprehensive a picture as possible of what's going on, because I think readers are by and large very, very good at discerning what's opinion and what's fact. And once and when they have a sense, when they are suspicious that you are trying to peddle a particular perspective, they really I think get their defenses up and can attack you with all kinds of accusations about why you're actually not a reporter at all, but just just an agent for one for one political kind of affiliation or another. So I think one thing we could do as journalists is perhaps just to, to really work hard at presenting the facts, and not only be, unbiased, but really just in our social media presences, in our reporting, be as be as fact focused as possible, rather than getting into this quite vicious cycle of accusation, and then having to defend ourselves against the accusation of bias.
Well, since we're talking about practical steps, I'll say I believe, though, that the platforms do have a role. They need to take greater responsibility, particularly when it comes to safety of journalists, and especially women journalists. We've seen too many cases now of the real life violence that we've talked about, and in extreme cases, killings of journalists, where the pattern was clear. There was a clear pattern of this online abuse, which very often is not taken seriously enough in the first instance. So I think one practical tip I would give, I'll take moderator's prerogative there, is to journalists, do take it seriously. If you get threats against you, take them very seriously, report them on the platform that they occur at, and take it to the police. And it's very often in many country contexts difficult to then get the information that's needed to take it forward, but take it very seriously. Don't downplay it. I think many of us have a tendency to just dismiss it as more trolling and try to move on. But in the extreme examples, I'm thinking of cases like Daphne Caruana Galizia, Gori Lankesh. They were both killed after a very long pattern of this escalation of online harassment and online violence. And journalists who we believe are at risk now, who need to be protected. I'm thinking of the wonderful Rana Ayub in India, who gets more vitriol online than anybody else I've ever seen. So I think it's that, take it seriously, report it, and then to the platforms, the call then is to do their part to root that out, to shut down that violence, and to cooperate with authorities when a criminal case is indeed launched. Taking it back to the broader issue, including these issues too, though, Eloïse, what are your thoughts on solutions for this? How can we better protect journalists, and particularly freelancers?
When we created REC, we were especially in need of knowledge about laws and justice, a watch about how law is changing and how it can involve journalists. And we were also especially in need of knowledge about health, about the post-traumatic syndrome, and a way to mutualize legal fees if needed, which is one of the big problem we encounter. The number of investigation or lawsuit filed for libel, receiving stolen goods, or involvement in a non-authorized or forbidden protest in France are increasing greatly. So it's one of our main solution. We sensitize population. We create tools like secured messaging threads for days when we're on the field. We organize watch tour to transmit news in and out of the collective in case something turns bad. Legal support is very important too for arrested or threatened journalists. And I think everything is to create depending on the situation and the size of the group, and how we can make things depending on the context. That main point. And for social media, I don't know how organization can put some highlight on the problem, but it's a really important problem, very a subject of concern for us.
And Trevor, the same question to you. What do you think in terms of solutions?
Well, I guess are you referring to solutions for freelancers specifically, or use solutions for journalists who may be covering protesters, or solutions for freelancers in general? I mean, we could certainly talk about all the above, but there, unfortunately, there are a myriad of problems that face journalists in today's climate, and some of the solutions might work for some, but others face other problems.
How do you see the way moving forward in the US, specifically with safety, let's say, including of freelancers, but safety of journalists? How do you see the climate improving in the US?
I think there has to, I think we need to go back to accountability, which, we all talked about earlier. If journalists can be arrested for covering public events with no punishment happening for the police officers or the police departments that conducted the arrest, if they can be physically assaulted, if they could be shot at with rubber bullets or other projectiles that are potentially lethal, when it's clear that they are marked as press, that they have press credentials, and the police knew they were press, then really the police are just totally disregarding the First Amendment completely. And so, there's certainly some things that the federal government can do, but really this is going to come down to a state and local issue, because it's the cities themselves that control the police departments. It is the state and local laws that allow or disallow for punishment of police officers when they engage in these acts. So until there is a local movement to strengthen journalist rights, particularly when they're covering protests, I'm afraid that these types of events are going to continue because, while the administration is about to change the United States, there's no sign that these protests are going to be letting up, because these protests were not about Donald Trump or any other one politician. They were about a systemic problem with police and essentially the impunity which they're allowed to act under. And so it's the same impunity that allow them to arrest journalists. So until that problem is fixed, I'm afraid that these types of events are going to continue.
I think you're right. And of course, it's systematic. And of course, as you spoke about earlier, there's a role for local authorities here. But one thing I think we would like to see at Reporters Without Borders is a clear public indication from a Biden White House that this sort of aggression and violence against journalists will no longer be tolerated. We think that would send a very powerful signal throughout the country.
Yeah, and it's a great point. And that's not to say that the administration doesn't matter, because it absolutely does. So for example, if the Biden administration, there's not, maybe there aren't federal laws that can help journalists on the ground, but what the Biden administration can do is direct the Justice Department and Civil Rights Division to investigate these individual acts on the local level, and that could potentially have some really positive effects, because if the investigations have teeth and there's real punishment coming from the Justice Department for these actions, then it's possible that the federal government could have a really positive effect on these local incidents.
Well, even stepping back from the United States and looking globally, I think it is about accountability. And this impunity centers on the question of political will. And I think internationally, we need to look for more ways to ensure or to pressure, states along, even if it's engaging with our own states, to then engage with other states to find these points where states can be pressured into ensuring accountability. And just from a policy perspective, to note one thing that Reporters Without Borders is advocating at a global level, we've been calling for the establishment of a UN special representative on the safety of journalists. Now, this would be a representative of the Secretary General, who would be tasked with ensuring that all of the existing UN mechanisms related to safety of journalists are actually implemented, and to serve as a sort of protector of journalists at the UN level, if you will. So we've recently renewed this call because the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has just over a year left in office, at least in his first term. We don't know if he will go on to serve another term, but we've called on him to fulfill his promise to take concrete action on this without further delay, so that his legacy will be of one of having concretely attempted to address this issue of safety. So thank you all so much. Did anybody else, I think we've gone a little over an hour. Did anybody have any final thoughts that they'd like to add? I think we've covered a really wide range of topics and have some really great suggestions to take forward. No, well, thank you so much to Trevor, Jiayang, Eloïse, and earlier to Banjo as well, who joined us, and to everybody watching this. I'm sorry that we can't be together in person this year, and hopefully next year we will be again. But thank you very much for taking the time to care about safety of freelancers and other journalists around the world.